I'm Shuchita. Nice to meet everyone. And currently, I'm working at Microsoft as a cloud solution architect. And I guess the cloud and Azure and everything has been really close to me because my own journey started with like a very public, with a very private cloud. So it was IBM private cloud, like back in the day. And then I slowly moved to the public cloud and learned about Azure. And I kind of realized that I really enjoy it. So I did very hands-on like DevOps and DevOps engineer role. And now I'm working as a solution architect. So this session is going to be very high level. I just thought, there is people who are thinking they want to move towards cloud. Where can they get started? What is it really? What's the hype all about? So that's what I want to mainly cover. So I will stop at multiple points, during the presentation and the demo. So feel free to ask me any questions, speak up or put them in the chat or whatever you feel comfortable with. And if you want to talk to me afterwards, feel free to reach out to me, LinkedIn, Facebook, whatever, and we can kind of go from there as well. So let's see. So the contents for today would be pretty much just starting off with, what is cloud computing and, what's with the buzzword and how come it's gaining so much traction recently. And then we'll jump into pretty much, what's IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. Then we'll talk about pretty much, what is the Azure construct and what's the Azure organization and, how do we get started about doing things in Azure. So we'll look at, how can we deploy some resources using the portal, and we'll also look at how can we deploy resources using some commands, and then we'll touch base on a little bit of like architectural thinking and things like where to next and how do we incorporate security and just that kind of conversation as well. So starting with, what is cloud computing, right? So as I said, I'm sure you all do keep hearing the term cloud and you're just like, oh, we'll put it in the cloud, we'll host it in the cloud, what cloud provider should we use? And that conversation happens very frequent. So simply put, right, cloud computing is when you're delivering the computing services such as, servers and network and storage and database, but you don't have to worry about the underlying hardware. So pretty much it is in the cloud or it's done over the internet as an end consumer. Now, this does take away all the hardware management. So as a customer, you don't need to care that do you have a data center or are you managing your servers and what's going on with that. So as a developer, you can pretty much, go and deploy an application or deploy a virtual machine and not have to stress about anything else. And the biggest reason why a lot of people are moving towards cloud and even just normal where individuals are using it for their daily things is because you just pay for what you use. So I don't have to pay for a lot of stuff that I'm not using. It's just sitting there. I'm just going to pay for, what I decide to use. Now, as you can see on this slide, pretty much. So these are all the services. I mean, they're not all. There's some of the services that Azure offers in different space within the cloud. So if we look at things like application, there's things like function apps or a web app or something to host your website. And
keep your hands to yourself.
All right. And if we look at things like data, there's things like, databases, which use your SQL, your Postgres, your Cosmos, whatever it is. And networking is when a fully different conversation comes in, like how am I connecting my on-premise to my cloud? And what am I using? Is it a direct connection? Is it an express route? And all that conversation. Now, identity part is usually, how am I logging into my services? So things like Active Directory, things like what's my identity system using, ID. And the last one is security and management. So things like, how is my workload secure? Am I keeping my secret secure? Is my network secure? And the whole security conversation. So now, I guess as an organization or as a person, you've decided, I want to start my cloud journey. So usually how it happens is in different stages. So the first stage is a lift and shift approach. So what you will notice or, what your organization will talk about is like, okay, great. We have all these things running in a data center, and we're going to pick that up and we're going to put that in the cloud. And that's supposed to be very easy because all you got to do, like, for example, if you have like a Windows VM or a Linux VM, you can pick that up and you can deploy that in the cloud because we have a lot of flavors of that available to deploy. Now, the second stage is where it gets into a little bit more cloud native stuff. So the discussion like, okay, I don't want to lift and shift. I want to re-architect or I want to modernize. So talking about things like, I want to use serverless. I don't want to think about an underlying virtual machine. I want to use containers maybe. So just having that kind of conversation. And this is something which, a lot of organizations are moving. There's a massive shift only because, less management, less initial startup, and all you do is pay for what you use. So yeah, so now what I'll do is I'll quickly touch base a little bit on the terminology that I was talking about, which was IaaS, PaaS, and software as a service. So on the left is what you have as a traditional infra on premise. So, you manage everything. You got to worry about the patching, the servers, the applications, and everything. Now, infrastructure as a service is where you don't care about the hardware. So I don't care where my data center is or what server it's running or where's the rack. But I do care about my operating system. So is it a Windows? Is it a RHEL? Is it a Ubuntu? Whatever that is. And I care about what's on top of that, my applications. Now, in infrastructure as a service, you're still looking after the OS. So you still got to think about, patch management and security patches and security updates and making sure your virtual machine is up to date with all the latest releases. Now, this is where I see, a lot of customers move towards platform as a service. So what that really means is you don't care about the underlying virtual machine. That is technically managed by your cloud provider. So you can just say, hey, I want to run a website, and all it needs to do, let's say it's a static web page, it's displaying whatever. All you got to do is you got to have your code for your website. You can put it in a Azure App Service, for example, and it will just show you your web page. You don't care what's the underlying virtual machine. You don't care about the patch management, and that's not anything you manage. And another good thing is with the app service or the function apps, you only pay for what you're consuming. So it's a very minor cost to start off with if you're using it very less. Now, on the last side, which is software as a service, is where you have things like all your web-based tools and applications. So things like Office 365, which, a lot of organizations use as a mailing service, or Dynamics 365. Now, this is completely in the cloud. So as an end customer, I don't look at what's running under the hood or anything at all. All I'm doing is just using the email, and that's all I'm doing. So I'm using the software as it is. Now, what I will do is I'll jump into like how Azure works and how, we organize the resources and talking about regions and so on. So once you've decided like, okay, I want to start my Azure journey or I want to start my cloud journey, you got to start thinking about, what do I do? Where do I deploy things? So you need to think about how much does my application need to be available? Do I need it to be very redundant? Can it have zero downtime? And you start thinking about how important is the application? Now, this is where the concept of Azure region comes in. So your region is pretty much, as the word region says it, it's a location. So we have a region in Australia East, which is your Sydney, and we have a region in Australia Southeast, which is Melbourne. Now, within the region, there's also another concept of an availability zone. So what that means is within the one region, let's say Australia East, there is multiple different physical data centers that will host your workload. So if you think about that, right? So one location, but still 3 physical data centers running in the background. This helps you have, more uptime, less downtime in case there's a data center outage or a flood or tsunami or whatever. Your work is fine because it's still in another data center. But I know if there's a tsunami, there's other things to worry about, but just in terms of work. Now, availability zones has been a very important concept in Azure because you can, distribute your workloads and you can ensure that, okay, if I have my SQL in zone 1 and zone 2, if anything's to go wrong with zone 1, I know it's just going to be picked up at zone 2. No downtime, nothing, and it's just there. So that's just the concept we have. Now, what I'm going to talk about is how things are actually organized. And then we're going to, soon enough, we'll look at an actual portal and how we can do this and how everything looks. So I'll start on the top with a management group. So what a management group is, think of it as a overlying structure which manages your subscriptions. So you can apply security policies, you can apply access and restrictions to your management group. And all the subscriptions that are under it will have those restrictions or policies that you have applied. Now, a subscription is something that you kind of use as a grouping mechanism. So how I've seen it in different organizations is, a customer has a subscription for production and one for non-prod. And then within production, they will have their resource groups, which is very similar to like a folder. And that resource group can have your resources. So if you have an application one, which is a web app, your resource group one will contain the web app and the backend database and whatever goes with that. And your resource group two can maybe contain like shared resources, which is shared by different things. So now what we'll talk about is how can you actually start deploying to Azure. So there's multiple ways you can think about your deployment, right? And we'll look at the first two today as well. So the first one is the portal. So if you don't know, the portal is, I'll paste the link in after as well. So it's just portal.azure.com. And what it is it's like a nice little interface, and you can deploy a virtual machine or you can deploy whatever. And we'll run through that soon. Now, the second way to do it is using a CLI, which means command line interface. So pretty much what that is you have some commands which you run in your bash or your shell script or your command prompt. And those CLI commands deploy your infrastructure. So I can have some commands for a virtual machine, or I can have some commands for an application or a database. The third one is specific to Azure, I think, which is PowerShell, because of course it's a Microsoft thing. So again, very similar to command line, but it's in a different language. So commands you can use to deploy things. Now, the one that I've used most often, and I've seen big organizations talk about, and something you need to know as a DevOps engineer, is using infrastructure as code. So that's where things like using ARM template or using Bicep or Terraform comes in. So you're actually kind of writing a little code to deploy your application. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a brief pause and I'm going to kind of open the floor. If there is any questions, please feel free to jump in now. You can see something in the chat. And yeah, so the one question, is there any difference in performance if Azure instance is in a different region? For example, yeah. So very valid question. Of course there is. So a lot of workloads that are hosted in, for example, Australia East, if you think about it, they're physically located in Australia East. If I want to be able to access them from somewhere in Europe, it is better to have it closer to the location. But in saying that, depending on what workload you have, right? So you can have things like a content delivery network, like a CDN in front of it that can help you get to it faster. So you can have a CDN in multiple regions, but you can have your workload in one region. But ideal situation, if you know your workload is going to be consumed in one area, you should ideally deploy it in that area. And also, if you have a virtual machine and a backend database, I mean, ideally best to have them in the same location if they're going to be talking to each other, just for performance and latency purposes. I hope that answered the question. Yep, so I'll pause for like 30 seconds. If there's anything, please speak up. Otherwise, I'll jump into the first part of the demo. Okay, so what we'll do now is we will start by deploying a Windows VM on Azure. Now, the first way we'll do it is we'll click Ops and we'll click through the portal and we'll see what we do. And then we'll see that all these resources actually get deployed. And the second thing we'll try is actually using command line. And while it's deploying, I'll show you some things that we just talked about before, things like subscription, resource group, and so on. I will change my screen now and let me know if you can. I'm hoping you can still see my screen, but if you can't, just feel free to yell out. So first thing I'll do is I'll start kicking off the process to create a VM. And while it's doing that, then I'll take you through the portal and what there is and what we can and can't do and so on. So if I click this plus right here, this is just, as you can see, it says create a resource. And I can search whatever resource I want. I can look at these categories, but what I'm going to do is right here, it's a virtual machine. So I'm just going to click on create. Now, as I click on create, of course, there's a lot of fields I have to fill up, but there's only a few fields that are mandatory. So I'm going to fill the basic ones and I'll leave the rest alone. So subscription, that's fine. Resource group, I'll just create a new one for today. So let's call it Windows VM demo for 6th of April. Looks like that's reserved, so I shouldn't call it that. So I can call it demo for 6th of April resource group. I think that looks fine. And I can give my virtual machine a name. So demo for 6th of April virtual machine looks fine to me. And I can select my location. Let's say I want to deploy in Australia East. And as you can see, there's a lot of options in here. I'm not going to step through every single one of them because it might get a bit too much. But if you have specific questions, I'm happy to go back and address them as well. So I'll just say, I don't want to put in an availability zone. I just want it quite basic. I want standard security. In terms of image, I will select a Windows image. And yeah, I'll go for the standard size. Now, yep, I can go ahead and create a local username for this machine. And what I'll do is I'll also just create a really secure password. Once I click deploy, I will look at the chat messages because there may be some questions for me, so I will get right on to that after. I will leave the defaults as is, so I'll leave the inbound ports of RDP open. And I'll go to my next step. In terms of disks, so when you start deploying your Azure resource, what you'll notice is there is a lot of information. So you can read, what do we need to do? You can learn more. You can click on the eye and it'll tell you like, hey, you can choose between the managed disk you want and so on. So usually it's quite descriptive of what you want to do. So I'll select very basic because I don't want it to charge me anything. Encryption type, yeah, that's fine. Go on to networking. So in default, you can notice that the networking aspects have pretty much been filled out. So I'm just going to leave them as is. What it looks like it's doing is it's going to create a new virtual network. It's going to create a new subnet and a public IP for this VM. And you can see it says new in the bracket. So it's already doing that. I don't need to do anything special. I'm just going to let this be. Oh, this is, for some reason, this is not that happy. I think that should be fine. We'll just see as we go next. I'll leave them be and I'll go next. And I don't want anything advanced or anything fancy. So I will just have a review and see what it says. So this is just quickly checking my validation. It says, yeah, look, the VM looks fine. And this is the size of it. This is how much it's going to cost me. And I can just go ahead for now and click create. So while it's doing that, I will jump into the chat just to see what the questions are, if there is any questions. Okay, it's the screen. Can you see my screen now? Okay. Okay. Cool. Cool. So while it's doing that, what I'll do is I'll just give you a bit of a tour of the portal. Sorry about that. So as you can see, this is kind of the homepage of the Azure portal. So this is just showing me, the recent resources I have looked at. And these are just the services I can look at. And if I want to see all of them, I can just click on all services and this is what I can see. Okay, sorry, I'll stop looking at the chat because it's just distracting me a little bit. So if we start by looking at subscriptions, what you can see is this is my subscription. And if I want to look at all of them, I can just have a look here and I can see all my subscriptions here. Now, if I click on one of the subscriptions, you can see it's got the details that I was talking about. So it's got, the billing amount, and it's got a bit of a spending rate forecast that it can say, like, look, depending on what you're deploying, this is how much it's going to cost you. So it's telling me, like, okay, you're doing fine, but it looks like it's going to cost you quite a bit, by later this month. I can also set some budgets and like cost analysis to see where the money's going and so on as well. Now, as I said, within the subscription is where we have resource groups. So if I click on this resource groups tab right here, what you can see is these are my resource groups that are here. Most of these were here from before, but this is the one we just created. So if you remember, we called it Demo 604 RG, and I can click on that and I can see this is the one we just created. If I want to double check, my activity log should have a thing that, look, this was just created as well, but it's just taking its time. So now what I'll do is I'll show you the virtual machine that we just created before, which is within this resource group. Now, if you remember, we created one virtual machine, but if you look in our group, you can see there's actually a lot of other resources that also got created. So these were some of the options and parameters we were selecting as we were creating it. So if we quickly jump through it, the first one is a virtual network. So this is kind of the networking concept within Azure. So your virtual machine has to sit in a network. So it's called a virtual network or a VNet. So if I look at this VNet, within here, it actually has one subnet as well. Subnet. And that subnet is what my VM is sitting in. So if I click on that, there we go. There is a default subnet, which actually has all the IPs, it looks like. Now, going back to my resource group, the second one is my virtual machine. This says virtual machine. The third one is a public IP, which is associated with this. The next one is a network security group. I will touch base on this a little bit when we talk about security. And then also a network interface card and a disk attached to this. If I chose multiple disk, I would have seen multiple disk resource in here. Now, what I will do is I will take a quick pause, and I'll also check the chat to see if anyone has any questions so far. Yeah, so the first one, is the VM in Azure same as creating a server in AWS? So the equivalent in AWS is actually an EC2 instance. That's what it's called. But I'm pretty sure I have clicked through the process. It's fairly similar as well. The second one, just curious, the cost managed on web application deployed on SaaS, is it handled by vendor or the client? So when you say a web application deployed on SaaS, if you're talking about like an Office 365 or a Dynamics application, then look, the cost is handled by the client, and that's usually per license based. So if you buy like 50 Office licenses, that's how it's charged. But if you're talking about the web application, which is actually a PaaS component, so like an app service or a function app, then depending on how often you're using it, or depending on how many times your function app API is getting hit, is what you're going to get charged for. And price is very low. I don't know on top of my head, but it's a couple of cents per hit, or actually less than a couple of cents per hit. I hope that answered the questions for Dharani and Ruchi, but if not, please maybe ping me again or speak up if you want to. Ashwini, backup options. Yeah, so there is backup options, right? So this just like, what do I call it? Just like any cloud provider. So there is backup options. There is things like disk backups you can have. And there's also things like you can run site recovery or site backups, if I'm not wrong. So what I'll do is I'll quickly click around here. So this is just my disk. Quickly checking here. So if I look within my virtual machine, if I scroll down, you can see an option here called backup. So within here, I can say, hey, can you please back up my virtual machine? and you can create a backup vault, which is called a recovery services vault.
Yeah.
And you can have a backup policy to back up your virtual machine. So if you just see the policy details, you can say, look, every day at 8 o'clock, please do this backup and retain it for 2 days and whatever, and I can enable this backup. So yes, it does exist, but you do got to remember, backup obviously costs you because you're storing a snapshot or an image, and it's going to cost you for the storage and so on as well. Okay, awesome. So now we just saw that, I clicked through the portal and we created a virtual machine. Now, the second part I want to show you before I jump into, actually what I'll show you quickly is within this virtual machine, if I want to RDP to it, I can just connect and I can click on RDP, and this will just help me download an RDP file for this virtual machine. So for example, it did that, and it's right here. So I can just say, yep, I want to RDP to my virtual machine, and no, I don't want it to use my work login. So I'll just use the login that I created, which was Azure admin. And I will just copy my very secure password and I will log in there. So the reason I want to show you is because we'll quickly talk about some security aspects afterwards. And it's good to see that, look, you can remote desktop into this virtual machine. So it's just loading now, but yeah. I will just quickly let it load so I can get out of it. But just as a reference, that's how easy it is. So you create a VM, you can RDP to it, and if it's a Linux one, you can SSH into it, and so on. Across all this.
Is there an option to select Windows or Linux while creating VM?
Yes. So I think maybe because my screen wasn't sharing in the first part, the first page asked me an image to pick, and they had image like a RHEL, Ubuntu, Windows Server 2022, 2019, and so on. And I can pick any image from there.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay. Sorry, I think this is just taking a little bit of time. I will log out and be done. So while it's doing its thing, what I want to show you, the next bit, is I want to create a virtual machine again, but this time I want to use the command line. So as I said, command line is a preferred way because you can have templates and you can have fixed commands that you can pass around in a team or in a workplace, and everyone can use that consistent way of deployment. So the easiest way to get started with doing command line within Azure is you can just click on this console option or a Cloud Shell option. So that was my Cloud Shell, and it's just connecting now. I think I'll just need to restart it. So what this does is it just runs me a local Cloud Shell within Azure, and I can use that for my deployment. But if you like to work from your laptop or a Docker container or whatever, you can have a normal command prompt. For example, just a normal command prompt. And this command prompt, I can just run some commands as well, and I can log into Azure and run some things. But for today's purposes, I will jump to this Cloud Shell. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a resource group and a VM using the commands. Now, these commands can easily be found on Google. This is nothing, I've come up with or anything. It's just basic commands. If you Google how to create a VM, you will find it. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a resource group, which is just AZ group create, name of your resource group and the location. So I will just copy this for now, and I will paste it straight on my Cloud Shell. Now, this will create in like a second. So it looks like my resource group is there. If we want to double check, I can click on the resource groups. We are looking for something called Windows VM RG06, which I will refresh, and you will see it will not show up. Okay, that's very interesting. There we go. So just a tiny bit of delay on the interface. So as soon as I created it, it's pretty much here. I can click on this and it's currently got nothing in it. It's a very empty resource group. Now, what I'll do is I'll do the next bit, which is a command to create a virtual machine. So I've already put in the details in there. So AZVM create resource group, which is my Windows resource group, the name of my virtual machine. Then this is where you specify the image in a command line. So you can pick whatever images are available. Now, this is the size. Now, a size it's a very unusual way of specifying, I guess. It just says DS2V2. But if you look at the specifications, it tells you how many CPUs and cores it's running in the background. And then just some other details like, look, this is my username and this is my not that secure password, but it's there. So I'll copy this for now and I will paste it in here as well and enter. Now, what you will notice is, yep, it's starting to run and it's just running it now. While that's running, because I think it'll take around 2 minutes to deploy, I will quickly have a look at the chat again. I'll see if there's questions and then I'll go from there. Rdp Tool. Yeah. So Ashwini, actually the Rdp Tool is exactly the tool we use now. So if you actually go through just your Windows laptop or your Windows machine and you open the Rdp Tool, you can just put in the IP of the virtual machine and you can connect to it. You don't actually have to download that at all. Question on backup. When you can, does Microsoft support backup or it's done by third party? So my understanding is, I could be wrong, but it is done by Microsoft. So this is within the Azure. So if you select the backup option within your virtual machine, it is backed up in another resource in Azure, which is called Recovery Services Vault, and it's going to store your snapshots in there. So yeah, I hope that answered the question. Now, as we were talking as well, this seems to have done something. It said, look, I've created your VM and this is the ID for it and it's done. So far, no errors. And I can go in my resource group and I can refresh. And what you'll see is pretty much very similar to what we saw before, but this is done with a command line interface. Okay. So this was, I guess, the first part of the demo I really wanted to show everyone. Just, a subscription, a resource group, deploying with the portal, and also deploying with using command line. What I'll do is I'll jump into the second bit of what I want to talk about, and then we will talk about, we'll look at the second demo, and I will pause in the middle and ask questions as well. So going on to the next bit, right? We have just deployed a virtual machine to Azure. Or let's say we were deploying an application or a SQL database or anything else. Now, of course, you need to think about all these things, right? So you need to think about how secure really is it? So things like identity and access, things like securing my network traffic, things like, am I encrypting stuff? Things like, where are my secrets getting stored? Why am I putting my password in plain text? Things like kind of overall thing like cloud governance and policy. So all of these things, I do want to show you how you can do it, but I'll talk about it a little bit as well. So in terms of identity and access control, we have a thing called Azure Active Directory, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which is kind of an extension of your on-premise Active Directory. So a lot of customers, they use their on-premise Active Directory and they sync it with the Azure AAD. Now, this way, your users and groups are mapped in one location. And also, we have another granular control called RBAC, so which is pretty much stands for role-based access control. So things like, depending on what your role is, or depending on which groups you belong to, you have particular access to things and resources. So I will show you this within the portal very soon. Now, second thing is things like securing network traffic. So we looked briefly at the network of it. So when we created the VM, it had a VNet in it. Now that VNet, or the virtual network, how secure is it? What traffic is going in and out of my virtual machine? How can I control that? We did see that the virtual machine had a public IP. Like, is that really secure? Not really. So usually what I see in an organization or anywhere is you don't have a public IP for your VM. You usually deploy it in a private network with a private IP, and then you use things like VPN gateways to connect to it, just to add that extra layer of security, or a jump host. And also to secure your network in your virtual machines, you use things like NSG. So that was network security groups we looked at, and I'll show you how we can use that as well. Now, the next bit is also, encryption of data. So are we managing our data properly? Is the disks encrypted? Is it prone to getting, my bad. Yeah. So just making sure your data is secure. So that's in terms of your disks as well as your database. How secure, how encrypted is it? Now, this almost last bit is the secret management. So things like, where can you store your secrets? Why do I have to put my password in plain text in a command? Can I not reference somewhere secure where the password is stored? So that's where resources like Key Vault come in. So Azure Key Vault is a resource which is deployed physically on like hardware security modules within data center. So it's very secure and you can store your secrets and it's getting backed up and it's a secure way of handling that. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on was like end-to-end cloud governance, or how are you managing everything? So that's where things like your Azure policies come in. So that's what enforces the organizational standards and assess the compliance of your system. So things like, how secure is it end-to-end? How is it following certain policies or rules or templates? And we'll look at that a little bit as well and how you can control that. Now, I'll touch base on these a little bit after, but what I'll do is I'll jump back into the Azure portal. I'll take a 2-second break and check the chat, and then I'll go from there. So, Ruchi, yep, it's pretty much exactly the same. So if you're saying that, yes, that's right. So within your virtual machine, you can have granular control that you can say this IP can access this VM, and you can add that in the whitelist. But I think my understanding is in Azure, it does work a little bit differently. So you can add things like what ports you're allowing access to the system. Specific IPs, yes, I think you can. No, you can add that. And you can also add specific set of VNets or specific network blocks as well that can have access to your machine. So
thanks.
Cool. So what I'll do now is I'll get rid of the Cloud Shell because that's done its job. And what I'll show you is just Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory, I can just search for it here and it should show up. And just kind of basic identity and access management system. You can see like, okay, how many users are in my directory? Currently 2 users, and I can click on myself and I can see, what kind of roles are assigned to me. So I can have a look here. So within here, I can see, yep, I'm a global admin, which makes sense. It is my subscription, and that's what I can do. But if I was to add other people here, I can give them whatever permissions I want to give them and go from there. Now, if I look at any of my resource groups, what you'll notice on the left side is also it has an access control blade. So if I click on this as well, I can say, hey, actually, I don't want these people having access to my resource group, or I want to add, another user and give them access to my resource group. So I can do that through here as well. And I can give them whatever permissions I want. So role-wise, it can be a contributor, owner, and whatever. I can go from there. Now, the next bit I wanted to show you was your networking security. So when we looked at when we deployed a virtual machine, the 604 that we deployed, we were able to Rdp to it. Now, what if I don't want Rdp open in this? I don't want to be able to Rdp. I want to block that. So this is where I can go into my virtual machine. I can go on the left side. By the way, if you're a newbie to Azure, definitely explore everything on the left side. So have a look at what they are, click around, see what you can do, see what you can learn from it as well. There's lots of good things to learn. So I'll go to the networking, and what you can see is this is the inbound port rules, and this is the outbound port rules. So in my inbound port rules, number 300 says RDP, and it says 3389, and it's a TCP protocol and whatever, and it's allowed. Now, what if I just delete this? So I actually don't want to allow RDP. Once this is deleted, you can see that, yes, I allow VNet stuff, I allow load balancer, and I deny everything else. So ideally, if that RDP rule is deleted, I should not be able to RDP to my virtual machine. So what I'll do is I'll give it a minute or two, because I know it takes a little bit of time to reflect that. And then I'll show you that when I try RDPing to the machine, what really happens. So with this, that was kind of step one of how you would control, I guess, network security and access to your virtual machine. Now, let's try it now. I'll again download the RDP file. It's actually the same one, so it shouldn't matter what I use. Ooh. Yeah, so I think it's just going to try, and then it should throw me an error saying, well, this computer doesn't exist, or the RDP port is not open, or something along those lines, if I remember correctly. So just try for a few more seconds, and there we go. So the remote desktop cannot connect for one of these reasons. And that's, as I said, all we had to do was go into the networking, look at the network security group, which is this one, which is attached, and change my inbound port rule. Similarly, there is outbound port rules as well, which I can click on, what's really allowed, and other rules as well. Now, again, these are what's just kind of available out of the box. You can add rules yourself depending on what you want to, and you can delete the rules and configure them as you want to. Now, the last bit I do want to show you as part of this demo is what I was talking about in terms of policy. So I mentioned the word policy because maybe it's a little bit hard to explain, but what it is just kind of applying standards across your environment. So things like adding restrictions or adding rules and making sure people are keeping up with it. Because, technically in an organization, you don't really want anyone doing anything. You need to have some limits, rules, and what's allowed and what's not allowed. Now, if I look at if I want to see what policies are available, I can just go in the definitions. And there's a lot of policies available out of the box that you can apply to your resources. So I can actually look for a policy. Let's say it's called public IP. So I think there is a policy that exists which says network interfaces should not have a public IP. So if this policy was enabled, if I just go assign it, it wouldn't have let me deploy that virtual machine with a public IP. So it's just an example. Now, again, these are some inbuilt policies. You can export it, you can change it, you can make up your own policy, you can do whatever you like with it. You can assign a policy to a subscription or a management group or a resource group, and you can have exemptions if you need to for other resources and so on. Now, what we'll do is we'll have a look at a policy that I created a while ago, which is called allowed locations. Now, this is actually quite a common policies organizations use because, for example, as you mentioned before, if I'm an Australian-based company, I want my resources sitting in Australia. I don't want people deploying in US East or Canada or so on. So I put a restriction that, look, you can only deploy in Australia. So this is a policy I have applied to one of my resource groups already. So how does it really work is I'll show you now. So if I go to my resource group, I think it was this one. So VM104, this is a resource group I created a while ago. Now, I have a policy in here which says that I can only deploy in Australia. So if I was to click create, just any resource, so let's say I create a virtual machine again, and if I try to click create, also, as to the question before, this is where you specify your image for your virtual machine, and there's all the options here, and you can see all images and see what else is available. But anyways, so I can do whatever. And if you see my region, instead of Australia Southeast, let me just pick South India. And as I pick that, you can see a pop-up come right away, and it says policy enforcement, and the value doesn't meet this requirement. So I can actually click on this policy and say, well, what does it really mean? And it'll show me like, hey, look, this policy is applied to this particular resource group. And it says the only allowed location is this or this. So this is, again, another way of just being able to control what you can and can't do and making sure your end-to-end cloud is compliant and so on. So with that, I'll stop again for another 2 minutes. If there's any questions, please ask me now. Otherwise, I'll just jump into the last bit of today. Cool. So far, so good. So just jumping onto the last bit. Now, we talked about quite a bit of things, but just last kind of parting thoughts as well is we do need to also think about things like, logging and alerting, and how am I really managing and looking after my work. So there is inbuilt capabilities, things like log analytics and application insights, which I won't touch base on today, but you can set that up, and you can set up alerts. They can go to your, service system. They can go to your Slack. It can come to your email, however you like your alert set up, that can be done. Now, the last bit, of course, which is also very close to me, is just the automation and the DevOps part of this. Now, what we looked at today was the beginning part of the cloud, right? So we can deploy using a portal or a command line or a PowerShell. Now, what I really see in organizations is things like using automations and pipeline. So using things like Azure DevOps to deploy your end-to-end infrastructure, managing the state of your infra, having kind of updates in place, which doesn't mess with your system as it's happening. And just something to think about, and maybe we'll cover in a session in the next few months or something. Now, before I just close off, I'll check the chat again just to see. Many clients have the requirements that the data should not go out the region. Yes, of course. So this is, Ruchi, good question. This is actually a very important and a very common requirement. And that is why a lot of people do have that policy. And for a lot of data sovereignty things, and we do have a lot of government customers, right? And for them, their requirement is their data can't go out of Canberra. So their policies are specific to look, it must be in Australia Central only, and so on as well. So yes, it can be handled. Now, it may be basic, but what's the downloaded file you used to log in? Okay, if I go back to this, if I go back to any of my virtual machine, and if I click on the RDP, I think it just downloads your basic RDP client session file. I'll have a look again. So it's just a .rdp file. So as I said, if I was to, I can just go, is it MSC? I can just go my normal remote desktop, and I can just put in the IP address of this VM, which is here, and I can just connect. I don't actually need to get the file from the cloud. Last bit, yeah, cool. So just going to stop talking very soon. We already did the demo number 2. Quick summary. So these are all the things we covered. I won't talk about it again because I think you've already heard me talk a lot about it. But if you have any questions, look, ping me after, email me, and we can have a chat as well. Now, just some last things before I close off is there is a lot of free trainings and certifications that are available to get started. So especially Azure Fundamentals, which is AZ900, is a beginner's course. There is a free virtual training day coming up for it. So you can look at the link above and you can see when it is and register for it. Or my personal favorite is John's Learning Path videos, which I found on YouTube. So he's got multiple videos for any certification you'd like to do in Azure, and they are so good. And that's what I personally use for studying. And lastly as well, create your free Azure subscription. You get like a one-off credit, get started, click around, play around. And I think that's, in my opinion, the best way to learn as well. So yeah, I think that's definitely me for now. I'm done.